So welcome to this week's mini lesson on realism. So remember that realism is a reaction against idealism in a pretty significant way. Idealism is really about forms, the perfect table, the perfect window, the perfect pictures, the perfect tree outside the window, that all exist in mind, in our minds, and somewhere as absolutely perfect forms. That's Plato's idea of the cave. Being in reality is sitting in that cave, being in our reality, the sensory reality, is sitting in that cave and watching the shapes and the shadows that are cast on the wall by the fire. They're not real. To Plato, none of this is real in the sense of meaningful, authentic, the principal element that we need to understand. The real for Plato was outside the cave, in the sun, where logic tells us and we find those perfect shapes, those perfect forms, that perfect tree or window or picture. So for Plato, the idealism is that ideal realm that exists for us that we can perceive through deductive reasoning. We're born with these forms. We're born with an understanding of those perfect forms of tree and window and pictures. And gradually over time, with teachers who primarily lecture us and books, classic books, that give us insight into morals and justice that also exist in perfect forms, we come to perceive that perfect place, those ideals that are the reality for Plato, out in the sun, using logic and deductive reasoning. Namely, we know those forms and we can apply them to what we experience on this level. Realism uses inductive logic and inductive reasoning. Realism is based on the senses, what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell on a daily basis. Those sensory perceptions tell us about realistic realism and that reality. We can't know those forms without first knowing this table, those pictures that are all different. The tables are all different. The trees are all different. So we experience the world through our senses. That tells us really about natural law. And that natural law, like those forms in Plato, is unchanging. So, for example, a little while ago, I had a teapot on the stove and it started to whistle because it was steaming. Water was evaporating. That's a principle that we can see. We can apply heat to water and see steam as evaporation. We know evaporation as one of those principles that's unchangeable. Every time you apply heat to water, there's going to be some evaporation. That's part of that natural law. That's inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is looking at the details and then determining some greater principle and some greater idea, some bigger generalization. So realism doesn't start at the big forms. Realism starts at matter and how it's affected in different ways, cause and effect. And that matter teaches us about forms, teaches us about natural law, principles that exist unchangeably. They're eternal. The water is always going to boil, and the water is always going to evaporate when heat is applied. So realism uses the senses. Realism is focused on hands-on kinds of learning. Science is a great example of realism and realistic thinking. We can see something happen in science. We can see water boil. We want to know why. The application of heat, the idea and principle of evaporation, all tie into our sensory appreciation of that phenomena, and that teaches us about natural law and principles that are unchangeable, that are always going to take place. So it's inductive. We start at the details and we build into bigger and bigger generalizations, and that's how we know science. Mathematics is that universal language of science that is precise and is also unchangeable and immutable. So we'll always get the same kinds of solutions. We may not use the same path, but we'll get the same solutions somehow. So the teacher guides the lesson through the senses and guides the student to understand natural law through the senses and through observations. Form and matter are combined in realism. So that's the fundamental difference, and that's what realism is about. So I invite you to think about that in the coming few days, respond to the discussion posts. I really think that the last batch of discussion posts were particularly strong because they asked questions and they created a lot of detail about how Mrs. Jenkins' class would look. So continue that process and continue your asking questions, and you're hopefully getting some answers in the kinds of details that you can create about realistic classrooms. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time, and I appreciate you listening in. Bye-bye.